Hello guys, welcome to the second lecture. This chapter is going to cover culture, and it's also going to talk a little bit about media and the role that media plays in portraying or reflecting or maybe even creating culture. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we understand the definition of culture and how sociologists and other social scientists define culture as shared knowledge, values, and behaviors um, of a certain society, okay? A set of beliefs, traditions, practices that make up a people's way of life. We differentiate between non-material and material culture. Material culture meaning anything that's part of the physical constructed environment. So furniture, architecture, clothing, jewelry, books, buildings, etc. Versus non-material culture, which is our values, our beliefs, our norms. So culture is really our way of life. Culture is not universal. It varies depending on place and time. Um, Sociologists refer to the term cultural scripts, which was coined by anthropologist Margaret Mead, which basically means that every society and then sometimes subcultures within a society have different modes of behaving and different modes of understanding things. And a lot of times this has to do with symbols. So as I talked a little bit about on the first lecture, symbols vary throughout place and time. And more specifically, the meanings that we attach to words, our language, the meanings we attach to facial expressions, bodily expressions, clothing, what it means to be masculine versus feminine, what proper versus improper behavior is, what's deviant, what's not deviant, what's normal versus what's abnormal. All of these things change depending on the society. So in this sense, no culture is the normal, right way of living. It all just depends on what society you're coming from. This transitions into the next term, cultural relativism, which is basically the ideology that we should understand that there are differences across cultures. There are differences in norms and values depending on the place and time, and that we shouldn't pass judgment on these differences, that we shouldn't judge them negatively. Um, the idea is that um, nobody is inferior or superior. No cultures are better or strange, even. There is no normal or abnormal way of life. It's simply a matter of this is the norm in this particular society versus this other society. And it's very important as sociologists to be able to understand this concept. This is one of the biggest benefits of utilizing the sociological imagination. It allows us to not only not judge other cultures, but to look at our own cultures, to step back from our own lives and to examine what we're doing, our situations, how we're behaving, our beliefs, our values, in a completely unbiased manner. And this is really important because it's only through this type of perspective that we can recognize things that we're maybe not doing right in our society. And instead of accepting it as the norm, even subconsciously, okay, um, in looking at our society and recognizing that our norms, our values, our beliefs, they're not normal. They're forever changing. They can always change. In another culture, they're completely different. So why are we looking at it this way? And things need to change. And this will become a little bit more clear as the chapter goes on. Now, a question in cultural relativism is where do we draw the line? How lenient should we be with other cultures? What if you have an issue, an instance where human rights is coming into question? For example, the practice of female genital mutilation. I don't know if you guys know this, but in a lot of countries, specifically in Africa, in parts of North Africa and in the Middle East, there is a practice whereby young adolescent girls are um, circumcised, and it's considered a norm. It's considered something that all young women do, especially before they get married. And so, again, this idea of being very accommodating to other cultures, not passing judgment or assigning value, can sometimes be questionable and can sometimes be problematic, and oftentimes there is a line that needs to be drawn, so we should recognize this. Now let me go into detail a little bit about some of these terms that I've thrown out, and that's values and norms, and then we'll talk about socialization. Values are deeply embedded beliefs, okay? Moral beliefs about something being either right or wrong, whereas norms are how we act upon these values. Okay, I like to look at norms as the unwritten rules of society, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate to do, say, think, behave, how to behave, depending on the society. Now, let me give you some examples of both. Values. One of the examples of a value in the United States in particular is the value of individualism, and that is that people should be able to pull themselves up from their bootstraps, out of poverty, and through hard work and perseverance, they should be able to climb the social ladder. So if you're stuck in a lower, socioeconomic class, if you're in the working class, you're poor. It's up to you to work hard and to rise up. Now, this value goes along with the idea that our government should not give out too much help. Okay, Americans tend to be um, they tend to disagree with the welfare. So they don't like to give welfare. It's become part of our culture that we talk badly about people who are on welfare. It's even so deeply embedded in our culture that even people on welfare tend to believe that everybody else on welfare except them is on welfare for some bad reason, but that they're on welfare for a good reason. Oh, my child's father is out of the picture. I have medical issues, so I'm on welfare for a good reason, but those other people that are on welfare are not on welfare for a good reason. This value differs in other parts of the world. For example, in Europe, welfare is not frowned upon like it is in the United States by either the government or by the general public. Um, so services that we look at today in the United States as just kind of given that they're free, that you don't have to pay for them. Yes, you pay for them in taxes, but you don't pay for them as services, are things like police services and firefighters services. In Europe, many parts of Europe, that same ideology exists for many different types of what we would consider welfare programs. For example, families receive family allowances from the government every month. They receive free childcare. So these are government-sponsored programs. They receive free health care, and a lot of the universities are free, or at least they're very, very, very cheap. They're highly subsidized by the government. So this value of welfare is different depending on the place, and it is not, there is no one right or wrong way. Okay, so sometimes throughout this class, you'll find yourself in need of stepping out of your own situation and examining your own country and your own cultural values in a unbiased way. Okay, it's what we call making the familiar unfamiliar, and this is really, really, really important in this class. Um, and then in norms, an example of a norm would be, for example, in the United States, it is not a norm to marry your cousin. And again, this is something that we rarely stop and think about, but in fact, cousin marriages have been very normal throughout most of human civilization. And still in many parts of the world, cousin marriage is completely normal. For example, in Pakistan, some 60% of marriages are marriages between first cousins. Okay, so it is a norm in Pakistan to marry your cousin, whereas in the United States it's not a norm. Okay, that's just an example. Now, socialization is the process whereby we teach these norms, and the process whereby these norms, values, and beliefs become internalized to the point where we rarely think about them, and we accept them as truth and as normal without questioning them. Socialization occurs mostly through the family. Um, we are socialized by our parents. We're taught how to behave. For example, We teach our children not to go up to complete strangers and give them hugs. And this is based upon the value in the United States that says that people should have their own personal space, that everybody has their own bubble. And again, this varies too, depending on place and time, because if you go to certain countries, you will notice that people stand a lot closer to you than you might feel comfortable with because it's the norm. It's considered normal. They don't have that same value of personal space like we do in the United States. In the United States, we are very individualistic. We are very protective of our own space. So we teach these values through the process of socialization by teaching our children from a young age how to behave in a way that's acceptable depending on our societal values and norms. Okay, the next concept that I'd like to discuss is reflection theory, and that is a question of whether culture, remember our beliefs, our norms, our values, is a reflection of larger social structures and relationships cast out into the public sphere, or whether it's influenced by these larger social structures and relationships. The best ways that I can try to explain this is through examples. So I talked a little bit about Karl Marx in the first lecture, how he believed that culture comes from the economy or the economic system. So he believed everything flowed from whatever type of economic system a certain society had. For example, in agricultural agrarian societies, okay, pre-industrial societies where um, the economy, the mode of production was farm-based, this affected culture in many ways, namely in the family. Families tended to be larger. They tended to live amongst extended family members. The communities tended to be much more tight-knit, based on kinship ties, versus industrial and post-industrial societies, where you find a shift in from large extended families to nuclear families, meaning people living amongst only their immediate family members. Okay, also people living dispersed from their extended family members, so they might not even live in the same state as their parents or their sisters or brothers or cousins, etc. So in this sense, these larger forces can shape society. Another example is through the media, and there is a debate going on as far as whether the media has an impact or doesn't have an impact on our culture. Um, the reflection theory would say that the media merely reflects our culture that already existed. So, if you see a lot of violence in movies, well, that's merely a reflection of what already existed in this society. We already had a lot of violence, and the media merely reflects that. Or the question is, does the media exacerbate these situations, these scenarios? By having a lot of violence in movies, TV shows, video games, does this perpetuate the normalization of violence in our society? So that's kind of the question in reflection theory. And what most sociologists conclude with today is that there's a little bit of both. So the media may reflect somewhat on what's happening in our culture, but it also does have a profound effect on our culture. And the same goes for Marx, that the economic system can have a profound effect on our culture, but it's not a unidirectional situation. It's not so simple. It's a lot more complex. Okay, so speaking of media, let me define media. Media is any format or vehicle that carries information. Mass media meaning any vehicle that carries information, that communicates information to the masses. The first example of mass media was books. Nowadays, we've got the internet, we've got the radio, we've got newspapers, although that's kind of dying out a little bit. We've got TV, we've got movies, we've got the news, we've got video games, you name it. That's mass media. Now, one thing we have to know about the media in the United States is that currently in our modern American society, the media is controlled by a few very large, very powerful corporations. They're often called media conglomerates because they control not only television, but they control websites, magazines, newspapers, radio stations, etc. The question is that if so much of our information is coming from such few sources, How comfortable are we in the belief that we're getting fair and accurate information?